Our reading from Jeremiah this morning is one of the high points of the Old Testament. In it you will recall that God says, "I will make a new covenant with my people, not like the former covenant which they broke. And this will be the covenant which I will make. I will put my law within them, and I will write it upon their hearts." These words are really the foundation as well for the New Testament. They are behind the words that Jesus spoke at the Last Supper when he said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." In fact, these words from Jeremiah are responsible for the distinction between the Old and New Testaments, which some of you know were originally called the Old and New Covenants. The word testament coming from the Latin word meaning oath or covenant. Now, covenants have to do with agreements. The party of the first part will do such and such, and the party of the second part will do this or that. When you have such an agreement, you have a covenant. And the Bible is all about covenants. And the parties involved in the covenants are God's people and God. Covenants like the ones made between God and Noah, or God and Abraham, or God and David. Now, the Old Covenant was pretty straightforward. It said that if the people of God would follow God's law as handed down by Moses, then God would do his part and bless the people. You can read about these covenants elsewhere in the Old Testament. In 2 Chronicles, for instance, Josiah the king calls Israel to renew their commitment to the covenant. Unfortunately, this call to renewal and commitment was not often heard or heeded. Time and again, the people failed to keep their end of the bargain. And so God was under no obligation to keep his side. In fact, the people were so bad at keeping the covenant that God realized a new covenant would be the only solution. But before I get too far ahead of myself, let me explain a little more carefully. When God says to you and to me, "Look, here are the laws, the rules. All you have to do is follow them and I will bless you." It sounds simple, even easy, but it quickly turns into a disaster. And the reason it turns into a disaster is because we can't even keep the first of God's laws, which tells us that we are to have no other gods, let alone obeying the whole bunch of them. Modern day people and people of all times worship so many things. It's hard to say which has the greatest pull on us. But one thing is clear. Few people can honestly claim that they worship and adore God more than anything else in the world or this life. I know I should, but I also know that there are times when I don't. Charlie Brown is reading the newspaper when he says to Lucy, "It says here today that young people don't believe in causes anymore." And Lucy replies, "That's not true at all. I believe in a cause. I believe in me. I'm my own cause. If I'm not a cause, what is? I believe in the cause of good old me. That's the best cause I know. And I believe in that cause. I'm the..." To which Charlie Brown interrupts and says, "Good grief." The truth is, we don't even keep the first commandment very well. "Thou shalt not have no other gods before me." And so the old covenant is doomed from the start. There's another cartoon that shows two little boys in Sunday school looking at a picture of Moses holding the tablets of the 10 Commandments. And the one boy says to the other, "Why did God put the commandments on stone?" And the other replies, "So we can't erase them." The old covenant didn't hold up because the human heart wants to erase God's laws. And we want to make our own concerns and ourselves more important than God and God's concerns. So what was needed was a new covenant. A covenant that would go deeper than laws. A covenant that would cut to the heart of humankind. And so we find God saying to the prophet Jeremiah, "I will make a new covenant, not like the first one, the old covenant which the people broke." And what was this new covenant to be like? Well, God tells us, I will put my law with them, in them, and I will write it upon their hearts. Now, this sounds a little more complicated than the first covenant, and in fact, it is more difficult than just laying down the law, so to speak. The new covenant is written about in the New Testament, of course, and here we are told how God went about creating it. And here we are told exactly what this new covenant cost God. And the story that tells us about this is the story of Jesus, the Word made flesh. Jesus, God with us. Jesus, Savior, Christ, the Messiah, and suffering servant. Jesus, who on the night before his death, for us all lifted up the cup representing his blood that would soon be shed, and said, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. In my blood. This new covenant is quite different from the old. For one thing, it shows us the depth of God's love for us, and for another, it shows us the lengths that God will go in order to bring us into relationship with him. The new covenant shows us the reckless and risky nature of God. Reckless in that God shows what God does shows little concern for the pain and suffering that he will bear. And risky because when God does his part, the people can still choose to walk away. I ran across a phrase a few years ago that caught my eye. I might have shared it with you before. The phrase was risking the arm, and it comes from Ireland. It seems at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, there hangs an ancient door with a rough-hewn opening hacked in the center. The story of this door of reconciliation and the related expression of risking one's arm are remarkable and instructive. Over 500 years ago, two prominent Irish families, the Ormonds and the Kildares, were in the middle of a bitter feud. Surrounded by the armies of the Earl of Kildare, the Earl of Ormond and his followers took refuge in one of the outer houses of St. Patrick's Cathedral, bolting themselves in. As the siege wore on, the Earl of Kildare finally concluded that the feud was rather futile and foolish. As he stood day by day outside the great cathedral, he realized that here were two families worshiping the same God at the same church, living in the same country, trying to kill each other. So he called out to the Earl of Ormond. And as the inscription at St. Patrick's says today, he undertook on his honor that he should receive no villainy. But Ormond was not assured by these words. He was afraid of further treachery. So Kildare seized his own sword and proceeded to hack through the door. And when he had made an opening in it, he thrust his hand through. It was grasped by another hand inside the church. And the door was opened, and the two men embraced, and the feud between them and their families was ended. From Kildare's noble gesture comes the expression, risking one's arm. Risking one's arm involves peril. Family feuds being what they were then, when the Earl of Kildare thrust his arm through the hole in the door, someone on the other side could have severed it. But Kildare took the risk, and reconciliation and peace were made. God also took a risk, and God risked a whole lot more than his arm. Christ crucified is the testament to God's willingness to take risk, and through this willingness, God brought about peace and reconciliation to those who would take his hand into theirs. This is the new covenant. God's part was to come among us in flesh and blood of his Son, to suffer and die and rise again, so that we might know all about the infinite and eternal love of God. And what is our part in this covenant? Our part is simply to believe in Jesus Christ and to accept the limitless love that God offers to us through him. Now you might say that's a pretty good deal, and you would be right. It's probably the best deal we could ever hope for. And I invite anyone to accept it with joy and gratitude. But also let me say that upon your acceptance of this deal, God will be looking for a change in your life, a change that will lead to your obedience to God and God's law and will. I will make a new covenant with them. I will put my law within them. I will write it upon their hearts, says God. The new covenant requires only one thing of us, faith in Jesus Christ, whose resurrection and death are the witness to God's love and willingness to take risks for us. But the result of that faith, the result of our faith in Jesus, will be a change of heart, a writing of the divine law in our hearts in such a way that we will find ourselves moving toward God's will and toward a more godly way of behavior. And this will be seen, first of all, when our relationships become infused with a love like God's love. You see, when all is said and done, people don't have a change of heart because someone else lays down the law and demands that they obey. While this may bring about a grudging obedience, as long as they are being watched, it's not likely to cultivate a willing or lasting obedience. As a parent, I had an especially tough time realizing this. When I was married and not only in charge of Desiree, but 4 or 5 other kids, depending upon whether we had some foster children at the time. Somehow I had been taught, perhaps you had as well, that lecturing and scolding and criticizing will bring children to do and be what we want them to do and be. But my actual experience tells me something quite different. Rather than moving them in the direction I wanted them to go, these behaviors on my part often drove the children into deeper behavior that I wanted to change. One of my mentors in ministry, Bill McElwee, once shared with me that he often sat with parents who told him with great frustration how many times they have told their children to do this or not to do that. And he will ask them, does it work? And the parents always said, no, it doesn't. To which Bill would reply, then why do you keep doing it? The old covenant, the one based on simply laying down the law, was not effective. It did not change people. It did not make them good. And so God in Jeremiah announces a new covenant. And in Jesus Christ we come to understand that this covenant is not based on law, but on love. And nothing has a more powerful effect on the human heart than the experience of being loved, especially when you know that you may be unworthy of that love, let alone the risk-taking and reckless love of God. Love is what changes us, especially love that suffers for us, such as the love we see in the cross of Jesus Christ. And this is the kind of love we are called to show in our lives as well. For if the world is to see the love of God today, if the world is to see the love of Jesus Christ today, it will see this love in us or not at all. For you see, God has done God's part in the covenant. God has taken a great risk on our behalf, and now it's our turn. It's our turn to accept this love and to live it out in our own lives. It's time for us to take the risk of following in Christ's footsteps. It's time for us to move toward a risk-taking way of life similar to God's own risk-taking behavior. And that brings me briefly to our passage in Matthew. The passage that finds 3 servants being given large sums of money to hold for the master. How much money was given? Well, each talent given was the equivalent of over 15 years of wages. Of these 3 servants, 2 took the money and risked it in order to bring in more money. They took a chance with what they had been given, and they ended up doing quite well. The 3rd servant, more cautious, more fearful, did not want to take any chances. He was not a risk taker, and so he buried the money until the master returned. And when the master returned, what happened? Well, the 2 risk takers made out like bandits. They were rewarded for taking a chance. But the 3rd servant, the cautious one, the one who didn't take any risk, well, as we read, it did not end so well for him. In this text, Jesus gives us a stern warning. Discipleship is not about playing it safe. True disciples are called to take risk and to venture beyond the known and secure. The talents the master leaves with each of his 3 servants are the God-given gifts we have all received and are charged with using to the best of our abilities. The 3rd servant thought he was playing it safe when he buried that single talent given him by its master. But the master's judgment of this servant and his action reveal that if we wish to be disciples and to call ourselves faithful servants, we'd better do more with the gifts we have been given than worry about their well-being. God has never been one to play it safe. And a God not interested in taking risks would have never created humankind in the first place. But God not only risks creation, God also risks relationship. First with Noah, and again with Abraham, and with David and the people of Israel. And finally, God even risked the divine self by taking human form and suffering our death. If God risked everything in the person of Jesus Christ for the sake of our salvation, and out of his great love for us, doesn't it seem likely that this same God might expect more than self-seeking, self-motivated, safety-conscious behavior from those who have been so wondrously saved? One recalls Jesus' words to his disciples, "Those who want to save their lives will lose them, and those who lose their lives for my sake will find them." One can also recall the exchange between Jesus and his disciples the day the 5,000 were fed. With 5 loaves and 2 fishes at hand, Jesus told them, "You feed them, you give them what you have." It was very little, but ultimately it was risked, and the multitude was fed. This saying and story invite us to a deep trust in God, as well as a wild, risk-taking way of life. And they expose our fears and their true cost. Fear of failure, fear of punishment, fear of loss, not only paralyzed the servant in our text, but they had paralyzed many servants in many congregations through the years. Christians should be daring the impossible, knowing that they cannot finally fail. We ought to be in the thick of the action, willing to risk everything in order to be faithful to Christ and his calling. We ought to be willing to do anything for the sake of God's love for us and for all people. Our possessions, our talents, even our lives. Excuse me, I had a phone call. That hasn't happened, but, well, it happened this morning again. All right, let me get back to where we were. We ought to be willing to do anything for the sake of God and God's love for us and all people. Our possessions, our talents, even our lives, this building, this church, and all that is connected to it. Everything that God has given us in his love, we ought to be willing to risk for his sake. We ought to risk it out of our love for God and our love for God's children. Dr. John Westerhoff, a former professor at Duke Theological Seminary, told a story from his days as youth minister. He says he took the kids on a retreat, and on the first night it was reported that over $200 was stolen from the wallets and purses of the counselors and kids. And for a couple of hours there was a lot of anger and upset emotions and accusations. Dr. Westerhoff called the group together in one room, and he read them the New Testament story of the woman taken in adultery. You remember the story. The people are prepared to stone this woman for her sins. Jesus says to them, "Let the one without sin throw the first stone." And of course, they all drop their stones and walk away. Then Jesus says to the woman, "Go and sin no more." During the prayer that followed the reading, one of the boys came forward and confessed that it was he who had stolen the money. Now the question arose what to do about the boy. The group had just about decided to send him home when one of the kids asked, "Do you want to stay?" And when the boy said, yes, the group exploded with shouts of stay, stay. It was a risky thing for them to say. It was, some would say, a reckless action for them to take. But what else could they do? As followers of Christ, as children of God, what else could they do? And so they shouted, stay. And as they gathered round the boy to give him a hug, Dr. Westerhoff led them in singing Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. God says, I will make a new covenant, not like the old covenant which they broke. I will put my law within them, and I will write it upon their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. What a loving, what a risky thing for God to do. May God give us the strength to be as loving and as risking in our lives and in our church.